First of all, welcome. This is before we begin with Ivan Gomza, this is our last of our kind of seminar. A couple things wanted to say that it's been presentations have been amazing. We're in general we're just very pleased with how things have gone with this program, and we're gonna make every effort to sort of continue the non-resident program next year. We haven't kind of confirmed stuff, but we hope to do it. Next week, this is not the last session. So next week, we have two presentations on March 27th from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. Kiev time. Hanna Zaremba Kosovic and Katerina Butz will present, chaired by Marta Dichok. So please, I hope you are able to join then. The other thing is, I think we're gonna try to have a kind of wrap-up meeting sometime in April, early April. I haven't yet decided on a time, but to sort of get your thoughts on sort of the program and sort of how it might be improved. This is very much a kind of this whole kind of non-resident scholars program was very much done on the fly, so to speak, and I'm sure there's room for improvement in terms of subsequent years. So we really appreciate your feedback. A number of you have given written feedback, which was greatly appreciated. And if you're not able to make a meeting, or even if you are, sort of any kind of feedback would be enormously appreciated on our part. But in general, I just want to say that I personally have found this all very exciting, and it's just wonderful to hear about sort of kind of new research from such a diverse array of Ukrainian scholars. Okay, so with that, Ivan, I think needs no introduction, and why don't you go forth?
Okay, thank you, Lucan. So, dear colleagues, since April 2022, I have been busy working on my new book. But unfortunately, as those of us who stay in Ukraine we are aware of, living through a war, it doesn't facilitate the research and editing process. So the book has not been finished yet. But anyway, today I want to present some points, some chapters if you want, some ideas from the book, and namely those will be the theoretical framework and some findings I already have. And naturally, I'm really looking forward to any suggestions which you might have on how I could improve the manuscript in question. Okay, so let's go. Even amidst the horrendous destruction the war has brought to Ukrainians and to Ukraine, it is natural to wonder what will come after the hostilities stop. And the question is of utmost importance for both academics, and practitioners. Politicians, however, they fail to exit what I could call the battlefield mindset. For instance, Deputy Chief of Russian National Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, he promises to extinguish the Ukrainian statehood. On the other hand, Prime Minister of Ukraine, Denis Shmyhal, he has recently opined that normalized relations between the two states are impossible in the foreseeable future. So we can say that the fog of war is clouding the vision of practitioners, and it is the task for scholars actually to envision the future. And luckily or not, I think actually luckily, a crystal ball is not an accepted method in academia. We have actually a better tool because we can build probable future scenarios using the past as raw data. In other words, I agree with the framework outlined by the British historian E.H. Carr, who stipulated that, I quote him, history has some predicative capabilities in the form of generalizations. For instance, Carr explains, historians, they could predict that a revolution is going to occur in a country if conditions there in that country are the same as in similar countries where revolutions had already taken place. So, it works. So the idea of generalized predictions laid the foundation of my study. I wanted to tease out some possible trends in developments in Ukraine, Russia, and Russo-Ukrainian relations for the next 10 to 20 years, and I wanted to do it by examining some relevant past conflicts. To make myself clear, I don't intend, and I was not intending, to establish all regular patterns across the global human history. Rather, I had a much more modest task. I attempted to identify some tendencies in three critical domains. First, the regime institutions. Second, state-to-society relations. And third, trends in bilateral relations. And these domains, they comprise essential domestic and international settings. And I think that they offer an overarching projection of possible war outcomes. And in a minute, we are going to discuss the way I operationalized each of those three categories. But presently, I want to elucidate my case selection because it is really important. Case selection, it is really important for the validity of any scenario building. And despite an illusion that the more cases are put into the model, the more significant the results should be, a big N study, it hardly fits any meaningful and nuanced scenario building. I think, and not only I, it reduces each individual case to a narrow set of abstract parameters. Regime institutions, state-to-society relations, and above all, the peculiarities of bilateral relations instead are concrete historical experiences, and they must be treated as such. So because of all those considerations, I did not wish to reduce tendencies in the domains I'm studying to rotated variables in a theoretical model. And that is why I opted for a small N study design. To follow it, I examined the Russo-Ukrainian War alongside other interstate conflicts, and those conflicts were chosen according to a restrictive set of parameters. Those criteria, you can see them on the slide, but anyway, I'll call them yet one time. So I selected cases according to 6 structural features. First, the belligerents are sovereign states. Second, state-to-state relations are asymmetric. Third, the asymmetry notwithstanding, the conflict outcomes were unclear for participants and for the global community when the hostilities, started. 4, the conflict pitted against each other 2 different types of political regimes, one with a personalist and another with a collective type of leadership. Next, the conflict, regardless of its duration, provoked what I dub institutional and collective soul searching. In other words, there was an acute post-conflict performance assessment in both key institutions like military and the nation in general. And finally, the last criterion is that the conflict was waged by 2 industrialized and relatively modernized economies, and as such, it required significant war effort, including military mobilization. So using those 6 parameters, I obtained a list of 4 comparable case studies, and you can see them on the slide. Before we proceed further, I deem it is necessary actually to justify some of my criteria. To begin with, I am well aware that many in Ukraine today, we prefer to interpret the Russo-Ukrainian War as the latest decolonization effort. However, I opted against this way to consider the war. So I opted against considering it as a kind of anti-imperial struggle akin to Indonesian or Algerian war for independence. I did it for 2 reasons. First, recognized sovereignty is a valuable resource on the international arena because a sovereign state whose borders are violated, that state elicits a very different international reaction than a colony trying to break away. So unlike Indonesia in 1946 or Algeria in 1952, Ukraine enjoyed sovereignty for 30 years, and it played this card masterfully in 2022. My second consideration is that independent states, as opposed to anti-imperial insurgents, they possesses a more significant infrastructural and symbolic apparatus necessary to produce arms, stimulate patriotic sentiments, and regulate the populational behavior. So despite some colonial overtones in description of the ongoing war, Russo-Ukrainian War must be considered as a pure interstate struggle. And another note on one of my criterion is about the concept of asymmetry. Actually, that concept is of paramount importance for my research, and I need to elucidate it for you. In different contexts, asymmetry might mean unequal population size, uneven military-industrial complex, inequitable military budgets, or different levels of social cohesion. Structurally, however, there are four essential features of any asymmetry. First, almost by definition, two contestants enjoy different resources. Second, asymmetry is historically durable, so that both parties are aware of the lopsided nature in their relations. Third, and maybe most essentially, the disparity in resources notwithstanding, in an asymmetrical dyad, the bigger player cannot annihilate or subjugate the lesser. And moreover, attacking the secondary party is costly for the bigger one as well. So in a longer run, they must coexist, the bigger country and the smaller country. And finally, my fourth important note about the asymmetry notion, in general terms, the lesser part needs its sovereignty recognized, whereas a bigger part requires a kind of a differential behavior. So war, in other words, we can interpret it as an armed negotiation about the exact terms of asymmetric coexistence. And in particular, hostile actions are about the amount of due deference and extent of the sovereignty the coexistence should assume. And I think that asymmetry is undeniable if one considers Russia and Ukraine. There are, however, two additional points to be accounted for. First, the ongoing hostilities notwithstanding, it is possible, and we can say even desirable, to establish normalized asymmetric relations. Normalized asymmetric relations are conceptualized as acceptance by both a bigger actor and a lesser power of their different interests that, nevertheless, can be managed for mutual benefits. And actually, two of my cases, and you can still see them on the slide, I mean the Israel-Egypt dyad and that of Vietnam and China. So two of my cases achieved normalized asymmetric relations. Second important note on the asymmetry is that on rare occasions, a reversal in asymmetry is possible. The France-Germany dyad is a case in point. Before 1870, France, with its 30 million of people, vast territory, and one of the finest armies on the continent, so France was a bigger player if we compare it to Prussia, with its 17 million of people and unprotected boundaries. Actually, both numerous French incursions across the Rhine and humiliating Prussian defeats in the end of 18th and early 19th century, and those defeats that were inflicted by the French. So those defeats, they bear witness to the interpretation that France historically was a bigger party. And it is noteworthy that even during the Austro-Prussian War, and it happened in 1866, so 4 years before the case I was studying, so even during the Austro-Prussian War, Prussia was concerned with possible French reaction to Prussian victories and the land acquisitions. So we see that behavior of a lesser party. However, both the outcomes of the Franco-Prussian War and the further developments between two countries, they reversed the relations within the dyad and made France a lesser part. In this case, in Franco-German case, the scenario was made possible through the consolidation of German lands and some notable demographic trends. If Russia fragments, an advanced scenario of asymmetry reversal is conceivable for Russo-Ukrainian dyad. And once again, to make myself perfectly clear, I don't imply that Russia is for sure going to fragment, but an asymmetry reversal might occur and must be accounted for. Due to the scarcity of time, I cannot, explain the rationale behind other parameters of my case selection. If you have any concerns, please do ask me during the Q&A. I suggest we just go further. So the set of cases I have chosen, it actually enjoys a number of benefits. First, each conflict was enmeshed in the history, so that no war was a mere aberration on the long war way to peaceful coexistence. None, of the wars terminated cool or outright hostile relations. So the set is instrumental in studying the complexities of bilateral relations. Second, geographically, my cases, they span from Western Europe to Southeastern Asia, so they represent different contexts and they offer culturally independent regularities, which I am interested in. Three, taken together, my cases represent differentiated asymmetry. Let me explain what I actually mean. In terms of population, France was bigger than Prussia, as we have just heard, and just relatively weaker than unified Germany. 40 million strong Japan was 3 times smaller than the Romanov Empire. 3.5 million strong Israel faced 10 times bigger Egypto-Syrian coalition. And finally, 50 million strong Vietnam was dwarfed by 970 million China. And being aware of the scope of asymmetry, as we can see, it can be different. If we take it into account, if you want, the proportion of asymmetry, that gives me, a new dimension to project the Russo-Ukrainian war's possible outcomes. And finally, as I told you, there are 4 benefits of my case selection. Each case illustrates what I call a nested dominant power complex. Once again, let me give you an example. Vietnam played a dominant power role in its relations to Cambodia, but simultaneously, China was a great power in accordance in its relations to Vietnam, whereas the United States and the Soviet Union played a great power role to China itself. Likewise, in 1904, Japan was a kind of a great power to Korea and China, with Russia being a great power in relations to Japan and the United Kingdom in the relations to Russia. And that nested dominant power complex, it was, as I argue, essential for the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I think that it can shed additional light on the origins and the development of the conflict we are discussing and living through. I also must admit that there are some research challenges I faced up to. First, during the case selection, I followed an important methodological guideline. It was imperative to avoid the so-called selection on the dependent variable bias. So I must not select several wars meeting all my criteria in which the weaker state, say, was victorious. This would have torpedoed my interpretations. Fortunately, technically speaking, the purely military outcome, victory or defeat, it was not my dependent, but rather one of my independent variables. Still, and it is essential, it's a takeaway of my considerations, I needed a variation in dependent variables, and that forced me to build a model accounting for different outcomes and different factors. And yes, admittedly, the model, much more cumbersome. Second, I had to work with a colossal amount of material about the origins of each war, the way each war was conducted, and the repercussions each war provoked. And there is so much material that I'm still thinking about how to organize it in the best possible way in order to present both empirically based descriptions and valid conceptualizations. So it is an uphill battle, we can put it. And finally, I must confess that I'm somewhat limited in my ability to work with primary sources. I read only English, Russian, French, and German, which means I can cover the Franco-Prussian War and partially the Russo-Japanese War, cover the primary sources. However, while working with Yom Kippur and Sino-Vietnamese conflicts, I have no other choices but to rely on secondary literature. My sole consolation is that I am not a historian, and original archival sources, they do not constitute the bread and butter of my, that is, political scientist's craft. Still, these are limitations, and I just wanted to give you a signal that I am aware of them. Let's go further. So let's discuss the war per se. My general assumption was that a war stemming from abnormal asymmetric relations tends to provoke significant changes in a political regime, and those changes interact with the changes in the regional IR structure, and they both contribute to changing relations in the dyadic asymmetry. And admittedly, the domestic political regime category, it is too broad and rather abstract. So to narrow the focus of the empirical research, I studied 4 important points: the army, the executive, the elite's preferences to repress or rather to co-opt, and finally, the dynamics of political contention. And my focus is far from random because each component offers an empirically observable way to measure the regime's evolution. So that is something I was interested in, how the regimes evolved due to the strains of war making. And when we combine these domestic characteristics with the foreign dimension of propensity to develop a hostile, settled, or normalized bilateral relations, I think that we could build a model that should comprehensively describe the war-induced effects on both a single polity, say France and Germany, or China and Vietnam, and a dyad, this individual country belongs to. So now let me spell out my theory expectations. So for internal dynamics, I actually had 5 theoretical expectations, or if you prefer, we can call them hypotheses. So because the military is an institution that, obviously enough, responsible for war making, the organization of military directly transposes into war outcomes. And there is a growing scholarly consensus that foreign policy choices and ways a military option is being used, those factors, they are dependent on the regime type. In particular, we know that personalist regimes are notably pugnacious because of the lack of institutional constraints on their policy choices. At the same time, the military as an institution tends to underperform under personalist regimes because of so-called coup-proofing. Besides, there is a growing evidence that it is not the autocracy versus democracy distinction, but rather a personalist versus collective type of leadership which is responsible for battlefield performances. In particular, we know that military is less professionalized under personalized regimes, and as a result, it displays less impressive battlefield performances. So hence my hypothesis number 1, personalist regimes tend to underperform on the battlefield. However, the military is but only one institution among others. Battlefield performances and military organizations, such as military cohesion and staying power, they combine with economical underpinnings and maybe some external alliances, and those factors together, they determine the results of military conflicts. War outcomes, in turn, they alter the military's status and its political role. For instance, officers of a victorious army, they enjoy greater prestige, whereas a defeated army sinks into discontent and blaming. One way or another, typical civil-military relations alter with significant political repercussions after a war. One regularity, however, is to be expected. The officer corps of a victorious state undergo institutionalized politicization. I mean, its members, they gain additional access to and weight in regime institutions. On the other hand, defeated army broods outside regime's institutions, and it nurtures a predilection for clandestine politics and plots. So, my hypothesis number 2, due to the war, the military corps, the officer corps, enter politics either institutionally for victors or illegally for losers. When we combine those 2 hypotheses, we can expect that personalist regimes, when defeated, suffer a civil-military split, which impacts the nature of the regime and its stability. The destabilization effect should be less pronounced for regimes with collective leadership, let alone for those who actually managed to win a war. So that was my first axis of analysis, the army. My second axis focused on the role of the executive branch. Executives, as you are well aware, they come in different shapes and sizes. Emperors, prime ministers, presidents, supreme leaders, well, you name them. Regardless of the constitutional design, however, the executive power is directly involved in governance. And besides, it is through their control over the executives that personalities like Napoleon III and Deng Xiaoping, or political blocs like Israeli Mapai and Northern Clique of the Communist Party of Vietnam. So it is through the control over the executives that those cliques or personalities gained political preponderance. And moreover, executive branch's influence correlates with state capacity. So for all those reasons, which I am trying to present really, really quickly, I expected that the executive, that a way a country conducts a war and the war outcomes, they must or should be significant for ensuing consolidation or weakening of the executive. Here, for this reason, my hypothesis number 3, military victories enhance executive power, whereas defeats destabilize it. However, admitting the possible curvilinear relations between the war outcomes and the executive power, I soften probable causality by introducing the hypothesis number 4. When the national war effort is sustained by externalization, even victories do not contribute to significant enhancement of the executive. And hypotheses 3 and 4 combined, they offer, as I think, a glimpse into the regime's evolution alongside what Michael Mann defined as the despotic dimension of power. Quoting Mann himself, it is the range of actions which the elite is empowered to undertake without routine, institutionalized negotiation with civil society groups. So I think that hypotheses 1 through 4 combined, they should help to gauge essential shifts in the institutional design of any political regime. However, to adequately describe the political regime, we must also account for its relational dimensions. The notion of a political regime, by definition, describes how the power holders communicate with and govern the populace. And moreover, the populace is never a passive mass in the hands of the elites. People can espouse, eschew, or even directly challenge the elite's agenda and the rule in general. So I tried to grapple with the complex nature of state-to-society relations using 2 empirically observable variables. First, episodes of contentious politics, and second, the combination of strategies a regime uses to ensure its political stability. Once again, let me explain my rationale, my thinking. Intense industrialized open wars, and that is precisely the type I selected for my comparison study, typically requires considerable sacrifices from the population. In return for their blood and sufferings, citizens demand more from the elites and expect the state should meet their economic and infrastructural needs after the war ends. Besides, post-war circumstances, they tend to dissipate the rally around the flag effect, and they thus lessen the elite coherence. This provides new institutional allies for the citizens, and both factors are significant predictors of contentious episode spikes. So, like a whole range of theories brings me to my hypothesis number 5, which stipulates the post-war period will be marked with more vigorous contentious politics despite the purely military outcomes of the conflict. Next, the second, if you will, part of my study, it deals with the evolution of bilateral relations. I see that I made a mistake showing you the, sorry. Never believe in the technology. Yeah, so my hypothesis for the bilateral relations. Here I had a set of 4 theoretical expectations. First, I anticipated that war preparations should be inadequate in direct reflections of misconceptions and misperceptions proper to both members of the asymmetrical dyad. So for this reason, my hypothesis number 6 stipulated that war rarely goes according to plan, and there will be unpleasant surprises for generals and the political leadership. My second expectation was that given the historicity and complexity of asymmetric relations, which are by definition unavoidable, no war outcomes, even the victory of a lesser party, cannot settle problems of abnormal asymmetry. Instead, because a political leader's personality is responsible for perceptions, misperceptions, and reactions to the counterpart's moves, my hypothesis number 8 predicted that particular choices made by the leadership are paramount for initiating hostilities, settlement, and normalization. And finally, accounting for the structural nature of contradictions inherent in asymmetric relations, my last hypothesis stipulated that regional and global IR structure shifts facilitate the achievement of normalized asymmetry. Now, having spelled out all my hypotheses and expectations, we can finally go to some findings I am eager to share. So after I formalized my hypotheses, I tested them on the historical material. And as expected, hypothesis number 1, that personalist regimes do underperform on battlefield, it was corroborated. Hypothesis number 2 was also corroborated, so victories contribute to institutionalized politicization of the army. And hypothesis number 5, which stipulated, let me remind you, that post-war periods are very turbulent, it was also confirmed. However, the results for hypothesis 3 and 4, they are mixed. Just to give you several examples, both France and Russia internalized their war effort, both lost and saw the executive power curtailed. Vietnam externalized the effort and lost, but executive remained strong. And although Japan externalized the war effort, it won and the executive was enhanced. So to make a long story short, the relationship between the variables is more subtle and other factors definitely interloop. Next, I conducted what we could call a cluster analysis, and I did it to capture the broader picture of war making, war outcomes, and regime evolution. The following consideration was guiding me. We can clearly distinguish between desirable and undesirable developments for the regime's survival. For instance, poor battlefield performance, the army's clandestine politicization, and unbound political contention, they are clearly less preferable for regime survival than good battlefield performance, the army's institutionalized politicization, and contained contention. So when I situated the cases on the worst possible, best possible combination scale, and you can see that on the slide, some noteworthy tendencies became apparent. Victory, coded on the slide in green, is for sure an essential factor in regime survival. However, other factors, including the type of the regime, battlefield performance, and war effort, they are also very important. The worst case, for instance, was France, with a toppled personalist regime, 2 uprisings, one non-violent and another violent, a political stalemate, an anti-regime military, and a broad societal dissatisfaction. All in all, after 1871, when the Franco-Prussian War actually finished, France was a country in deep trouble and disarray. Russia fared only slightly better. Vietnam, although it lost its war, displayed valiant battlefield performance against the Chinese and later managed to contain political contention and military politicization through skillful collective leadership. And finally, Prussia scored almost maximum on the scale, and the country's meteoric rise in economic terms, geopolitical terms, and social terms, all those events, they bear witness to the importance of better combination on the scale for eventual war outcomes. And it is also noteworthy that being a small party, and small party are coded, as you can see, with small letters. So, for instance, Egypt is a bigger party, Israel is a lesser. So, being a small party in the dyad does not reflect negatively on the mid-term post-war perspectives. I think that is something we Ukrainians must account for. And I also think that the combination of already now known factors, such as the regime type, the battlefield performances, and the nature of the war effort, those factors, the known ones, they enable us to piece together the puzzle of what will happen to Russia and Ukraine. However, before I spell it out, let me point to several noteworthy generalizations. So something I think we also should be aware of. So first generalization is that Asymmetrical war alters the nature of civil-military relations. For victors, it exacerbates the prestige of the military, whose members enter politics, like in Israel, enter bureaucracy, like in China, enjoy a greater say in governmental policies, like it happened in Japan, and influence political decisions from behind the scenes, as it happened in Germany. For losers, it causes frictions between the political leadership and the army, because the former blame the latter for national humiliation. So as a result, the military morphs for losers into an anti-regime breeding ground, and we can see that development in France, Russia, and Egypt. So one way or another, for both Russia and Ukraine, the typical post-Soviet way of civil-military relations, of military men being apolitical, it is likely to be over. Second, following the defeat of the executive branch, especially in personalist regimes, we can see that after a defeat, the executive branch, it tends to suffer a diminution of powers. In France, the personalist empire was eventually substituted with a republican regime whose constitutional design specifically curtailed the role of the president to avoid a new usurpation of power. Russian Tsar, as you might recall, had adopted the power share principle for the first time in Romanov's history after 1905. In Vietnam, the northern clique of Le Duan lost its monopoly over the party and the state apparatus and had to share power with southerners like Nguyen Van Ly. And finally, in Israel, Mapai's dominance over the country was shattered with the advent of Likud. So this suggests that Putin's prospects to hold power after 2024 and Zelensky's second presidency in Ukraine, those events, they might be less secure than they seem for us today. Third, war effort is taxing on society, and as a result, political contention episodes are expected regardless of whether the country loses or wins. To illustrate, there were two French uprisings, there was a Russian Revolution, there were Japanese 1905 Hibaya protests after the victory, there were Israeli demonstrations of 1976, and 1977 Egyptian bread riots. A notable absence from that litany, from that list of troubles after a war, are Vietnam and China, which I think suggests that only polities with considerable state capacity can manage content, if you will, popular discontent. However, more often than not, wars, they erode state capacity, which foretells some troubles for both Russia and Ukraine ahead. And finally, regimes that suffer defeat or fail to conclude a preferential peace, they are doomed to face mounting discontent from the revanchist or hardline segments of the population. In particular, a nationalist backlash against governmental policies is to be expected. I'm not going to enumerate all the anti-regime organizations that were active in Israel, in Russia, in France. I just want to point out that Anwar Sadat, the Egyptian leader, was finally killed, murdered by Egyptian Islamic Jihad, precisely for the war outcomes. And unlike the unrest I have discussed just yet, which might be transient, extremist organizations, they tend to implant into societies and profoundly affect the societal climate. So by extension, we should brace ourselves for occurrences of right-wing extremism, and I would add, especially emanating from Russia. And as I told you, now we can build a plausible scenario. What is it? I think that in the next 10 to 20 years, the age of troubles awaits Russia, with violent contention, the politicization of the military, and a possible regime transformation. Ukraine is likely to go through turmoil akin to Israel after 1973, with bitter questions about the unpreparedness for the invasion, a hunt for internal traitors, and a vocal minority unsatisfied with the terms of the war settlement. But on the other hand, war heroes are expected to be in the parliament and in the cabinet, not conspiring against the regime. Most essentially, the vibrant democracy of Ukraine is likely to survive. At least that is my reading of the situation. And finally, just 5 minutes, and then I am really eager to go into the discussion. Regarding bilateral relations, my study actually corroborated all four expectations. So first, war resulting from asymmetric relations rarely goes according to pre-war plans because each participant nurtures misconceptions about the adversary. I'll give you several examples. In 1870, Prussia intended to conduct a limited war, but was instead mired in a people's war. France expected to be supported by South German principalities, but instead faced the German Union. Russia was preparing for another colonial expedition, but was shattered with a strain of defeats on land and the destruction of its fleet on the sea. Japan, on the other hand, geared for a short war, but was financially exhausted after a year of war making. In 1973, Israelis were convinced that Egyptians could be contained with superior air power, but then, when the war started, they realized that, as the saying goes, missile had banned the aircraft's wing. And on the other hand, Egypt crossed the canal to push for a diplomatic settlement, only to miss the opportunity and get a worse deal with the Third Army unexpectedly encircled and crushed. Finally, Chinese intended quoting Deng Xiaoping, to teach Vietnamese a lesson, but learned instead that their army was inadequate, whereas the Vietnamese boasted of having the third best army in the world, but failed to protect their border regions. So what we can see that each participant had his ideas how the war is to be conducted, and nobody actually realized the nature of the adversary and how he is going to fight against. So these conclusions that we are going to see more and more unpredictable developments, it is relevant for the Russia-Ukrainian war as well, because the brunt of unintentional political outcomes like Finland joining NATO or Germany eschewing Russian energy supplies, they're already here and more are to come. Well, the recent, just 2 days long declaration of Putin as a person to be prosecuted for war crimes is also something nobody expected even 5 months ago. Second point, whether a lesser party wins, like Japan in 1905, loses, like Vietnam in 1979, or results are unclear, as for Israel and Egypt, the outcomes of a military conflict do not resolve problems of asymmetrical regional relations. On the contrary, tensions and hostilities are to be expected unless mature asymmetric normalcy is established. So concerning the Russo-Ukrainian war, it is imperative to see over the narrow horizon of a ceasefire or even a peace treaty and elaborate strategies that could normalize asymmetric relations between two countries. Third, in asymmetric relations, leadership is paramount for initiating hostilities, peace settlements, and normalizations. The wars I studied would not have erupted without Bismarck and Napoleon, Nicholas II and Katsura Tao, Deng Xiaoping and Le Duan, Anwar Sadat, and yes, Golda Meir. So those wars, they would not have been possible without political leaders, each promoting their agendas and being directly responsible for hostilities. On the other hand, and that is a silver lining, normalization was purposefully opted by Nguyen Van Linh and Jiang Zemin, by Sergei Witte and Ito Hirobume, by Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin. So when no such leadership, the one open to negotiations, is available, as it was in the Franco-German case, normalized asymmetrical relations, they remain unattainable. So my conclusion, as long as Putin stays in power, Russia-Ukrainian relations, they are bound to remain off balance. And finally, the last point, normalization hinges upon regional and global IR structural shifts. For instance, by 1910, Russia abandoned resentment toward Japan because first, it settled its differences with Great Britain. Great Britain was Japan's partner and the member of alliance. And second, both countries, Japan and Russia, they joined the camp opposing the Central Powers. Likewise, Egypt established durable relations with Israel at Camp David after it had opted for US patronage. Conversely, the Sino-Vietnamese relations remained poisoned 10 years after the war per se, until Vietnam joined ASEAN. And finally, the Franco-German case, the reconciliation between those two countries, it arrived only 70 years after the conflict in question and had not been possible outside the Cold War framework. So I believe that the normalization between Russia and Ukraine will not be reached unless Russia abandons its hostile attitude toward the West. So how can two states, and that is the final point I'm making, so how can two states lock in hostile asymmetric relations, actually find a way to normalized and mutually beneficial coexistence? My cases suggest that there are actually notable regularities for achieving normalized bilateral asymmetry. Those cases are coded in white on the slide. The best news is that normalized asymmetry is not fiction. 3 out of 4 cases I studied, they reached the normalized asymmetry in the mid-term perspective. Only the French and Germans needed 2 disasters of 1914 and 1940 to fumble for a solution. As my findings suggest, 4 steps are necessary: reestablishment of formal diplomatic relations, respect for the lesser part's sovereignty, 3, symbolic deference towards the bigger part interests, and most essentially, an institutional framework that contains and resolves issues of disagreement. Somehow counterintuitively to the lay people's opinion, reconciliation, like the diminishing of societal anger toward the foe, it is not a prerequisite for normalized asymmetry. To give you just one example, citizens of Vietnam, they continue to consider China as an existential threat, but these sentiments, they don't spill over official relations, at least right now. So for the Russia-Ukrainian case, the biggest stumble block is Russia's respect for Ukrainian sovereignty. There are numerous signals that Putin and his entourage, they remain delusional that they could impose their political control over Ukraine. However, I believe that there is a silver lining. More and more Russians, they eventually will realize that a country able to mount a year-long resistance and inflict tremendous casualties on Russia, this is not a runaway colony, but an independent state. Sooner or later, Russian political leadership will grudgingly accept the fait accompli and shift the policy toward Ukraine accordingly. And whether the relations would normalize, that question hinges upon leaders' choices on both sides and the effort of the international community to establish a new framework for regional order. So thank you for your attention, and I am really eager to hear your questions and suggestions.
Thank you, Ivan. That was amazing. That was incredibly thought-provoking. I'm sure we'll have a kind of very active discussion. To start things off, I just want to sort of, I mean, I have so many reactions. I want to sort of, I can't sort of keep them straight. I mean, first of all, I just want to say that I think this project is a wonderful project. It's obviously sort of, you know, a hugely important question, and I like the fact that you're sort of doing this long before, I mean, you know, the sort of what we know is going to happen in Ukraine. And I think sort of the idea of sort of assembling what sort of the comparative knowledge is and what this tells us about what will happen in Ukraine in the future will be a huge contribution regardless of what happens. And I think sort of even having the record of your book about what the expectations were, you know, before the war ended, you know, I think it will be of enormous scholarly value, whether or not you're right, you know. But I just have a couple of sort of, you know, a few questions and responses, and then I'll let others step in. The first is, I was a bit unclear about where your hypotheses came from, whether they were from the cases or from the broader literature. You know, because it seemed like at one point, I think you said you tested the hypothesis. At first, I thought the hypothesis came from the cases, and then you said you tested the hypothesis on the cases, and others that was a little bit unclear. In general, I mean, I think, you know, you could make, in terms of case selection, of course, one can make infinite number of choices, and I don't want to sort of complicate things more. But I do think, one thing about the cases that sort of is striking is that they're all very short wars. I mean, like, a lot of people don't even call the Chinese Vietnam War. It's more of a kind of a punitive action that lasted for about 3 weeks. Didn't really have any kind of, they just came in and they showed that, punished in a sense Vietnam for invading Cambodia, and then they left. And of course, the Yom Kippur War was a few weeks. The Franco-Prussian War was less than a year. I mean, these are all kind of, in that sense, very different conflicts. And I don't think there's anyone who thinks that the Russo-Ukrainian War is going to be anything but a very long, extended conflict. Second, relates to asymmetry. It's certainly obvious why you call the Ukrainian, well, you think of the Russo-Ukrainian War as one of asymmetry, but I mean, there are a number of cases, the Afghanistan War, where the aid from a foreign power effectively made these wars relatively symmetrical. And Ukraine is not the only one, right? Think of Afghanistan and the like, and some others where a smaller power with the aid of a foreign power kind of basically was able to sort of achieve a level of symmetry. Next, in terms of I understand sort of I think it's really you explicitly sort of include wars that aren't sort of decolonization, which is interesting, and it's a way of thinking about it. It is still really hard to think of this war without the colonial element, or that seems sort of very non-intuitive. And I mean, in terms of sort of understanding things like, I think that's just feels off to me. But I mean, I'm sure you have a response to that. Finally, I think I'll just end this. I actually think you shouldn't be limited in your theory building to these cases, because I think they are so different, and so I would just, from what's going on in Ukraine, I mean, I don't see a reason why you shouldn't sort of explicitly bring in sort of the vast literature in comparative politics on war and regimes. I mean, which obviously a great deal about. I mean, there's Nancy, and so I don't see why you should be limited to these cases in theory building. So I would encourage you to sort of not limit yourself, because it feels a little bit artificial to limit your theory building to these cases. And of course, the literature does support the idea. A lot of the literature shows that sort of war increases inclusion of women, of Blacks in the Western context, and also decolonization. I think there's a kind of general consensus that African participation in World War II greatly facilitated the decolonization movements, in Ghana and other places. And also in terms in the supporting the idea that war supports inclusion or democracy, Nancy Brebreau's forthcoming book, also it's called Democracy After War. So it definitely is relevant to what you're saying. So, if you want to get a copy, you should write her, or I can help you on that. But I think it would definitely, and not to mention, of course, the literature, which is less relevant to regimes on sort of Tilly and state building, of course, but that which also seem relevant. But I don't think you necessarily have. I think in general, I guess my final comment is that I think it would be helpful to sort of be a bit more clear about what your dependent variable is. I mean, it's right now your dependent variable is very sprawling and large, which is okay, which is fine for a project at this stage, but ultimately you're going to want to sort of really, hone it down and sort of make it lean and mean. Otherwise, I think it's too easy for people to get lost in the sort of huge variety of different sort of hypotheses and potential outcomes. But that's more of a kind of packaging issue. But I think that's it's normal at this stage. But anyways, that's basically, I think it's a really wonderful project. It's very exciting. So I don't know if you want to respond, or you want other people to sort of ask questions. It's up to you.
I think I'll make several comments so that people maybe get better what I was working with and how. And actually, thank you for your comments, Vulcan, because first of all, it was not like the grounded theory approach. So it is not that I took 4 wars and then from them I took my hypothesis. Actually, I worked backward because I worked with the theoretical literature, starting with Steele and Michael Barnett. Well, I mean, there are plenty of them whom I worked with. For instance, yes, Cantwell Tindlage and the host of literature about battlefield performance, another host of literature on how the regime evolution is affected by war. So I read that literature, and for me, it was really important, to string it on the asymmetric conflict. I'll explain a little bit later. So, but when I read like the host of theoretical literature, I advanced my theories, and then I tested them, hypotheses. I tested them on the cases I took, which actually suggests that, after the small n study, we can then, embroad the case selection and check on whether it works for other cases. So I worked with theory, and theory laid foundation for hypothesis. Is like the
right. So I just that's great. I would do that a little more explicitly than you do. I think sort of, and also establishing whether, because in some literature there's consensus and other there's not. In other words, it's not just drawing from theory as if like theory is this thing that oftentimes people just there's no consensus, and sometimes there is a consensus. So I think it's useful to sort of indicate that right off the bat, because in cases where there's not consensus, I think your treatment of it'll just be different. Sorry.
No problem. Well, actually, I decided, not to enumerate all those authors on shoulders of whom I'm standing, because I didn't want, to tire us with that part. Well, but what was essential, and the one name is to be called, is Brantley Womack and his book on asymmetric relations, because it was really important, and it relates to what you asked me about why I am not taking colonial wars, liberation wars, and so on. So, because he advances a very nice metaphor. He says that we should consider those countries, like in asymmetric dyad, as a giant and a rock. A giant for sure can push a rock, can hit it very badly, but when he does it, he hurts the giant himself as well. And that is the nature of relations between the lesser and the bigger parts. I mean, China could punish Vietnam. They did it. But on the other hand, they had some pains in their leg as well. And that relates to all those dyadists I worked with. I do agree that, the problem for case selection was those wars are of lesser duration. Why? Well, because actually all the huge wars, the long wars, they are actually coalitional wars. I mean, take World War I, World War II, take some other interstate. For me, it is essential. Interstate, not anti-colonial struggle. Interstate wars, they tend to be either coalitional or they were in the very distant past. And I needed modern economists in a fighting. Modern economists that mobilize people, that uses industrial complexes to build weaponry. So it is also part of the theory. So I'm aware that Yom Kippur and Sino-Vietnamese War, they were small. But what is important, and that brings me back to the asymmetrical conflict, war is not some blood spilled on the peaceful road. War between asymmetrical parts is actually something to be expected. I mean, after Vietnam was punished by China, they had skirmishes for another 9 years, and they had problems in relations until Vietnam had not decided, well, I have to change my policies toward China, and China was gracefully accepting the signals by Nguyen Van Dien that they are doing it. So the point I'm making is that asymmetry is important, and being important, it refocused my attention, not on the durability of war, because war per se is just an event, but on the relations which are important.
Yeah, I mean, there's also Iran-Iraq, which is also asymmetrical in the, Iran was much larger than Iraq. But anyways, but there are sort of infinite number of cases, and so I don't think you need to sort of, I never, I don't think you should go do more research. I just think as long as you're sort of aware, obviously you are, of the limitations of your case selection, I think that's fine. But anyways, anyone else want to jump in? I'm sure there's sort of lots of reactions. Anybody else? Yeah, Petro. Go ahead. Petro? We can't hear you.
I said, thank you, Lucan. Thank you, Ivan. I missed the beginning of presentation, but what I heard was really fascinating. Really, I like it. But let me tell you that I completely disagree with you on Yom Kippur War. First, that's not criticism. That's just that was not just the war with Egypt. That there was Syria also. Yeah, it was the part of the war. And while in the end, Israel has made a peace agreement mediated by the US, which is important as a third player. We still have no peace agreement between Israel and Syria, right? For many reasons. And one of the reasons is that Syria, after this war, remained a staunch ally to the USSR, while Egypt made a different decision. Also another point is that on the politicization of officer corps in Israel, as far as I know from the memoirs of Yitzhak Rabin, yes, Mapai was a very strong group inside the Israeli politics, but actually I would say that was another process took place in Israel even before the Yom Kippur War. It was not the politicization of military, but militarization of society, which started in the 1930s when Israel settlers started a clandestine war against Palestinians, and that was obvious, and against the British colonizers. So they had to be militarized society from even before they declared an independence, in a way. Also, actually, I found your analysis on other cases is very interesting. What I would just an idea crossed my mind. What do you think about analyzing from this perspective the Russo-Georgian War, so-called 5 Days Wars of 2008? That would be very interesting to see and to apply this this approach that you used. Again, and just and my last question: how would you categorize the Hitler's regime and Stalin's regimes of USSR, whether they were collective or personalized?
Okay, thank you. I think I'll start with the like in the way you asked me. So with the Yom Kippur, well, the point about Yom Kippur and why it is really important, like a case study, and I would argue that it must be here, is that here again we see a situation when one war is just a pearl on a string of other wars. You had several wars: the War of Attrition, the 6-Day War, the Liberation War for Israel, and you have wars afterwards. Well, they settled with Egypt, and that is very important. Egypt is and was the predominant Arab state, and normalizing relations with Egypt was a huge achievement for Israel. I mean, Syria, it actually remained hostile not only because it remained in the orbit of the USSR, which, by the way, corroborates my interpretation that the changes in IR regional and global structure are essential. They also were the real losers. They lost Golan Heights, whereas Egypt, it received the Sinai Peninsula. So the point I'm making is that Yom Kippur is essentially an interesting conflict to be studied here because it shows us the nature of asymmetric wars, asymmetric relations, and the war never resolves everything. It can resolve something, but you have actually to work with a bigger picture, with a bigger perspective. Now, with your reading of the civil-military relations, Israel, I actually concur. You are right. But the point about Mapai and the advent of Likud is that actually, unlike the 6-Day Wars or the War of Attrition, which actually made the Mapai more powerful because they showed, well, that leftists, they can do the job. The Yom Kippur and the shock, Israelis are still asking, so who actually was guilty of the lost? of the defeat, although we cannot argue that that was technically a defeat. So the Yom Kippur, it was different. It brought Likud first as a social movement, and then as a power, as a real contender. And there, around Likud Mapai, that contestation, we actually see not Yitzhak Rabin, but much more important figure of Ariel Sharon, a guy who actually went into politics straight, like brandishing a mantle of a real victor of the war. And that is important. That is depoliticization I meant. Not like the whole society is militarized, because we saw that with Romanov's Russia as well. The aristocracy was, like a military, they had their military duty. That was something they were doing. We see that the politicization means going to different camps, going to different directions. Not everyone, each Israeli is like a soldier, which they are, but also that they're different soldiers from different parties. That is something Yom Kippur made, unlike previous wars, and which actually still resonates. And I hope I explained at least a little bit my rationale. And regarding the Hitler and Stalin regime, for me, in my interpretation, Stalin is for sure a personalist regime. I mean, that is a typical neo-patrimonial regime with a small clique of yes men around the huge boss who controls everything. Yes, he uses like prerequisites of ideology and so on and so forth, but technically the decision-making is very despotic. So that is a despotic power in Michael Mann's notion, per se. And Hitler, well, that was a personalist regime as well. Because, I mean, when he pushes his general to go into France and do what they think is military impossible, he shows his personalist drive. And then he pays, and the Germans as well, for his personalist obsession. Okay, thank you, Petro. Thank you for your ideas, because they help me, to elucidate the points I was trying to make.
Okay. Anybody else? So if there's no one else, I just one other comment to more about presentation, Yvonne has to. Sometimes it was a little confusing about, the outcomes, whether they referred to sort of Russia or Ukraine or both. And I just think in the presentation, you should just make that clear, because obviously one would expect, or maybe one shouldn't expect different outcomes, for the different cases, or whether, I think that sort of was a little unclear to me in the presentation.
Okay, well, the concise answer will be that outcomes are for sure different, because we have a personalist regime on the one hand and a collective leadership with different ways of battlefield performance. One is much or less good, another is much or less bad, and also all that parts of the puzzle, which shows that the directions will be different, trajectories will be different. But I do agree that maybe I should put it more pronounced. For sure, in book it will be like that.
Right, of course. Victor.
Yes, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation, and as a historian, I always appreciate cogent and well thought out presentations by political scientists who actually explains how things work. I have two questions, comments. It was very interesting your dispensing with the colonial label for this war. On the other hand, but those that have been observing Ukraine and both internally and externally have always talked about how Ukraine really didn't have much of a state. They say, in 2014 the state really started existing. There's really, the state was partly fictitious, and there was, of course, the deep state. On the other hand, there's also ties with Russia that continue, are very close. That there's still colonial leftovers, remnants of the colonial, very much. I mean, almost in front of us now, the church, but in general, infiltration, whatever mentality. So I don't. Again, the hybridity and the entanglement, word we hear too much about, is still there. That's my first question. The second is, you're very upbeat about the possibility of reconciliation of Russia, realizing that this is something, a nut that they can't break. On the other hand, and I personally, my gut feeling is that something, eventually the bottom will drop out in Russia, something unexpected will change. But right now we have Russia. I mean, this war is, if anything, this war is about the unexpected. We could list like 10 things now that we completely didn't think would happen. And one of them is the information control that was achieved in the age of the internet and free flow of information. Nobody really expected that. The ability to double down, to close off. And right now we have, Putin and his regime are doubling down. They're pushing, we just heard recently that school children are being taught that Lenin invented Ukraine, and I wonder where that leaves real historians. But anyway, so right now we see the movement in the other direction. So, umov Россию непонятно. I would not be so confident as you were that there will be some reconciliation. Again, this is one of the unexpected things that it seems that there would be, but there you have it.
Thank you, Victor. I'll respond to the first question and then ponder over the second. Actually, those not are questions, but like reactions. And I think I can also react because it is about the exchange of ideas. So I think that we Ukrainians, we actually too easily adopt that anti-colonial lenses when we think that, well, we are fighting against the imperial power. Yes, we are. It is true. But it is not what is the most essential about that war. To see the differences between a real colonial, anti-colonial struggle and what is going on right now, we don't have to go further in territory than Ukraine in 1917. Because Ukraine in 1917 was a runaway colony, disregarded and despised by all global society when they tried to buy weaponry, when they paid for them and they did not receive it, when their emissaries came to Paris and London to be totally ignored. So what happened 100 years ago was a situation of colony. Today, although I do agree that our state was infrastructurally feeble and it had numerous deficiencies, that card, which I mentioned, of full-fledged, recognized international sovereignty, that is something really important. I mean, even China says that it is to be, the sovereignty of Ukraine, it is to be respected. Even Germany, who used to say, well, guys, you have under 3 days and then who knows what is going to happen, they changed their mind because sovereignty is a very powerful resource in the international relations. So that is the point.
I was not pushing back. I think you're right, basically, but I just wanted to say that it's a bit more subtle than that.
Yeah.
So I would actually like to push back. So a few things. One, there are a lot of anti-colonial wars in which the colonized got significant support. Look at the Portuguese experience where they got significant. The Guinea-Bissau wouldn't be Guinea-Bissau, and Mozambique wouldn't be Mozambique if they hadn't gotten significant Soviet and Eastern European support. Second, I think does it really? But even more, I think the perception of it being a colonial war is important in terms of one of the outcomes you're trying to explain, which is the likelihood of reconciliation. Because as long as Russia perceives Ukraine as a colony, then that affects whether or not they're going to sort of acknowledge the atrocities. And also the same thing goes to Ukraine. As long as they perceive, I think more rightly, as Russia as a colonizer, that's going to affect the reconciliation. So I just worry that it kind of it impacts your decision to sort of really not include the colonial dimension. I think that kind of affects your theory in terms of the outcome, because there are very plausible arguments that link colonialism to the longevity of the conflict.
Another comment, well, two. First of all, yes, we have situations like Bandung Conference when, for instance, the third world countries, Vietnam and Indonesia, who have already achieved independence, when they meet their Algerian brothers in arms and say, like Ho Chi Minh did, well, Algerians, ask us something about the ways fighting Frenchmen because we know how to do it. Well, we have that. And moreover, we also have situations when Netherlands actually were pushed by both Moscow and Washington to grant independence to Indonesia. So we see that it is true. But what is important that process actually was done in that status of a recognized party was done in a process and was very painful for Front de la Libération Nationale, for any other group which was fighting for independence, whereas Ukraine already had it. So if you want, we had a head start. And using that head start, yeah.
Okay, but then, so I guess I'm confused as in terms of how, I mean, I guess I'm confused in terms of the outcome you're trying to explain. As why is this head? I mean, you might be right that sort of, that Ukraine had more of a head start because it was 30 years of sort of recognized sovereignty. I think that I'm sure you're right on that, even compared to whatever Guinea-Bissau or Mozambique, whatever. But like, I guess the question is this difference sufficient enough to completely exclude the colonial, paradigm? It feels like, that feels just weird and wrong to me. And I'm I mean, just given the fact that it's so obviously important in terms of the conduct of the war on both sides. I mean, would Ukraine have really resisted as much as it has if it did not perceive, Russia as a colonizer? And would Russia have undertaken the war in the first place if it had not sort of assumed that Ukraine was part of Russia? And so these are like pretty essential to the war, but yeah.
Well, I actually think that is a valid point. I mean, Russia was not definitely going to attack Ukraine unless it considered it as a country. I mean, not a country, a failed state, whatever. But let me give you another example. Vietnam used to be a colony of China. Well, back in the 16th century, the Ming dynasty actually controlled Vietnam. Then they actually helped to grant it sovereignty. But since that period of time, and Vietnam became independent from China in the 18th century, they used to coexist as unequal partners. And that is something I think invisible for Ukraine as well. Ukraine is going to be a smaller part than Russia unless Russia fragments. And that is another scenario. But the point is that we have to consider us not as a colonial state. We are post-colonial state, but as a state with its legacy, with its hard relations with Russia, but still that must not, drag us back. Yes, Ukraine would not have fought as good as it did unless it perceived Russia as a colonizer. Vietnam, by the way, did the same. They were using the resources, that is the cultural resource. Le Duan used the cultural resource of Chinese colonizers coming here, and all the stories about Vietnamese fight of three sisters fighting the Chinese invaders. But still, the cultural resources is an important part in addition to other. So I would say that, look, at what I was trying to do is actually not to take the most obvious answer, because for Ukrainians, colonial aspect is very obvious, and it is something, I cannot deny it, but I wanted to focus on some other aspects.
That's appreciate the I think you just, but I just think you need to sort of acknowledge that. That's all.
Just to finish my point, there's a second question. So basically, I guess we can all agree that Russia is a colonial power, neo-colonial power, whatever, it's in that mode. But if you just say it's not a colonial war, then it becomes sort of like DeSantis's territorial dispute. And we use colonial because it has traction. I don't know, with the left we thought or whatever, that, if it's a colonial war, that means they're bad guys, we're good guys. So there's that aspect to it too. But I appreciate your point. My second question was about, of course, you being rather sanguine on that Russia will come to terms, and I don't see that, though. I somehow gut feeling is that the bottom will drop out. Thanks.
Well, here with the Russia coming to term, it is a projection for sure. And I think that, the point is that regional IR structure is more important than down-to-earth feeling. I mean, I think that Ukrainians are not going to, rely on Russians anymore, not going to perceive them as brethren or whatever. So they will not be the closest other as the Russians used to be. And Russians, they are not going, to discard completely their condescending attitude toward Ukraine. That is to remain. But on the other hand, Frenchmen are still not very, positive about Germans. And Germans, sometimes they have very bad jokes about Frenchmen. This does not preclude working relations. And that is the point I'm doing, that when we build a new internalized international structure of regional accommodation, then those animosities notwithstanding, we can actually coexist. And the point of that coexistence is the following. Russia accepts Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, they don't say anymore, well, there is no such state as Ukraine. We prove them that there is. And on the other hand, Ukraine does not do such thing as, let's rename Russia to Moscovia, or let's stumble on them just for fun, or just, to make them feel uncomfortable. Because it's not the way you are building mutually good, beneficial relations. I mean, it is not coming in a day. It is not coming in a year. Maybe in 10 years, with a new Russian government, that is essential, and a new Ukrainian government, we will build those kind of relations.
Because right now there's no Ukrainian state, there's just the Kiev regime.
Yeah, exactly. So they don't recognize Ukrainian statehood once again.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
I mean, I kind of say that I appreciate, Ivan, your point about, that it's not, I mean, I think if you frame it as like, acknowledge that there are obvious colonial elements, it's like, who wouldn't acknowledge that, but that it's not simply that. And I think that in a sense becomes part of your contribution, that it's sort of, it's more than simply a colonial, anti-colonial conflict. So I think that, but as long as you acknowledge, then you sort of, because if people feel like, you're saying it's not a colonial conflict, or that's unimportant, then people are just gonna, not accept anything you say.
He missed something important. Yeah, I know. I do agree with you.
I think it's a question of framing. It's a question of framing. So anyways, okay. Any other questions? This is really great, exciting project. Okay. Well, that's fantastic, Ivan. Thank you so much. I mean, this is classic, Ivan. This is like big historical thinking, with lots of interesting cases, and sort of, this is going to be a really wonderful book. And I mean, one thing I think you might consider in terms of, publishers, I don't know if you've thought about that, is, talk to me, because I think, this would potentially make a good popular book in the West, because everybody's thinking about these questions. You'd have to write it very differently than much less.
I must confess, I actually think that book is to be published in English. I mean, I'm editing it in English and thinking about having it published in English.
So I think, I don't know with the scholar, I mean, it's very, but anyways, but these questions, I mean, it's a little, I mean, it's a little hard in terms of scholarship, because it is necessarily speculative, right? Because you're not sort of, you're dealing with what might be, but which is a problem in terms of, the scholarly literature, because, it's hard to sort of deal with kind of predicting the future. I mean, as much as that's really not what comparative politics does, that's more kind of what the publicisti do. But I don't think there's anything wrong with publicistica. And I think, but there's a huge market for that here in Canada and North America. And so I think you should consider, and I can give you contacts, or potentially people, that a kind of a more kind of popular audience. So I think these are just the questions that everybody is thinking about. So with that, and thank you so much.
I'll be very grateful for those contacts.
Okay, that'd be great. So anyways, with that, so Martin Tichok is up next week. I look forward to that, and so long. Bye-bye.